Meet Bob Messener, a seasoned IT leader with over 25 years of experience in higher education. As a current CIO and CISO, a former CTO, Bob has a deep understanding of the challenges and opportunities facing institutions today. He's a CISSP-certified information security professional and holds a master's degree in information systems technologies. Bob will be discussing the latest regulations, including the Gramm-Leach-Bliley Act and FTC safeguard rules, and how AI can revolutionize cybersecurity and higher education. Get ready to learn how to protect your institution from emerging threats. Turning it over to you, Mr. Messener.
So cybersecurity is a huge topic. So what I'd like to start with is talking about it from what is the most valuable asset in any organization, whether it's higher education or any other industry. And the answer to that question is data. When you think about it, hardware can be replaced, buildings can be replaced, but when you lose your data, you lose the most valuable asset your organization has. So cybersecurity is all about how we protect that data. So as you think about how we collect it, the process by which we collect it, the process by which we store the data, how we classify that data, whether it's for public consumption, for private consumption, whether it's completely confidential, ultimately how long we retain that data, who has access to that data, how we use that data. All of that is encompassed around our data and our most valuable asset and how we protect it. So as we continue to talk about processes and policies and federal regulations that all impact cybersecurity, think about it from the lowest context there is, and that's your data, the most valuable asset. So we'll start with a policy, for instance, an acceptable use policy. In most cases, in most organizations, the acceptable use policy just talks about how you can use the hardware and the software within the organization to access the data, to update the data. So these policies exist with the sole purpose of protecting the data that's stored on your systems. Think about the privacy policy that you have, hopefully on your public website. That privacy policy is actually designed for the people that are giving you their data, their personally identifiable information. And it's talking to them specifically about how you're going to hold that information private, how you're going to protect it. And then ultimately, you wrap around that the idea of data governance. And data governance talks about how long you're going to retain the data, what measures you're going to put in place to save that data, protect that data, ensure that only authorized users have access to that data. These are some of the policies that we use to protect the data that we have. Now we're going to kind of walk through this again from a data perspective and a breach. And we'll get to why we're looking at it through these lenses here shortly. But you want to protect your data from a breach or unauthorized access. And how you do that is simply what users have access to it, what level of access they have to the data. Do you monitor the machines that they're using, known as endpoints? That's the laptops and desktops that are connected. And then do you monitor the network that is used to connect those endpoints to the data? So thinking of it from the access control first, you only want to provide access to your users with the least amount of privileges possible. Call it the rule of least privilege. And you do this so that you don't give them more access than they need. But what happens typically in organizations is when you start out in one role and you receive access to do the work that you do in that role, and then and later you either get promoted or you move to a different department, you get a new layer of access, in some cases layered on top of the access you had before. And what ends up happening is you start to grow this amount of access that you have. And you need to ensure that there are audits inside your organization to make sure that you only have the appropriate level of access needed for the work that you need to do. So again, I'm going to take this all the way back to data, and it will make a good bit of sense. That data that you're trying to protect, you want to make sure somebody who is authorized can get to that data, and someone who's not authorized cannot. And when we talk about not authorized, that's where we're talking about these bad actors who are going to do everything in their power to get into the network, to be able to get to that data, and to either take that data or lock that data from your ability to get to it. We talked a little bit about endpoint monitoring, and that's the computer, the laptop or the desktop that's accessing it. What type of software that you have on it, and how are you doing endpoint security on it? That's the next layer of security that you have to have in place inside really any organization to ensure that that laptop doesn't have a Trojan or a virus or some type of malware sitting on it that it's then going to use to corrupt your data, copy your data, or steal your data. And lastly, we talk about the monitoring, and they know this, that it's now known more by MDR than anything, which is a monitor detection and response solution. But that's looking for anomalies on your network. So when a laptop is connecting to a server that it's never connected to before, that's considered an anomaly. And when you have that MDR solution that's constantly looking at the flow of network traffic between endpoints and servers and endpoints to endpoints, it's very easy to see when something doesn't quite look right. And all of these technologies we're talking about are really powered by AI. So I'm going to take a little sidebar here and just talk shortly about AI. Artificial intelligence is everywhere. It's in everything we do. It's in the cars we drive. If you have adaptive cruise control, it's in inside your house. It's like your Alexa devices. I use my Alexa to set timers when I'm cooking in the kitchen, and I just have to say verbally what I want it to do, and she does that for me, which is fantastic. These AI devices are everywhere, but AI is still an evolving technology. So it's evolving and it's doing more for us. It's creating a safer environment for us. It's making things easier. But in the world of cybersecurity, it's being used both by individuals who want to protect their data and protect their systems, and it's also used by the bad actors. So we see it being used by the bad actors in the new types of phishing emails that we're seeing. Back about 10 years ago, when you would look at a phishing email, there would be capitalization issues, there would be misspellings, there would be poor grammar. Well, now with the advent of all the AI that's available, these bad actors are taking what they consider to be the message that they wanted to use. They're running it through an AI system, and now all of a sudden it's coming out with perfect grammar, perfect capitalization, perfect spelling. It sounds 100% legitimate, and they're making sure that they hide the links better using this technology. So AI is certainly being used by these bad actors to do some pretty horrific things. Back to the data breaches for a second. Again, it's all about protecting our data. What types of plans do you have in place to protect your data? That's the next thing you have to start to talk about. And we're protecting it from a breach. So specifically, how do you protect your data in the event of a breach? And the first place that you need to start is an incident response plan, because an IRP, or incident response plan, is a plan that outlines who's responsible for what in the event that you believe there has been a breach or an attack on your network and someone has tried to do unauthorized access to your data. Beyond an IRP, you have a business continuity plan. And a business continuity plan goes hand in hand when a breach occurs, because in most cases when a breach occurs, you have to figure out how you can restore access to the data to your legitimate authorized users while shutting down access to your data from unauthorized users. Some cases you have to stand up systems in different places. Sometimes you have to reconfigure your network to make it less accessible from remote and more accessible from within. 2020 did a lot to our country, but one of the things it did inside technology was it forced more and more companies to adopt virtual private networks, or VPNs, and allow users to be able to connect to sensitive and important data from off campus or off companies' property. So by doing that, of course, you open up a whole layer of risk as well to these bad actors who can also do their best to attempt to go through those VPNs or connect to those VPNs and get to your data. Finally, you have a continuity of operations plan. And that continuity of operations plan really exists to say, okay, if we had to, almost pick up where we are and make sure that all of our services worked outside of just technology, what else is needed? How do we make the payroll still run in the event of some type of emergency? How do we ensure public safety? How do we ensure, the financial status of the institution continues to run? That's what a continuity of operations plan is. The next thing we start to talk about is what are the requirements if you have a data breach? In most cases, the requirements are about when you have to tell the impacted people that a data breach occurred. But a lot of states have very different regulations about how soon you have to do it and to who you have to do it to. So how do you tell them what happened? And in most cases, most state regulations now say once you've confirmed you have a breach, which means you now know that your data has been taken by or read by an unauthorized user. The second piece that they have in those regulations is how many individuals are impacted. I will tell you in the state of Pennsylvania, where I live and where I work, the regulations just changed this year. It used to be 1,000 individuals had to be impacted for it to be considered a true breach that we would have to notify the Attorney General's office. This year, with the new change to that law, it's now 500 records that have to be breached before we contact the Attorney General's office. That's half as many, which means the number of reported breaches is going to increase as a result of that. Another thing that goes hand in hand with this is cybersecurity insurance. I'm sure many of you have heard about cybersecurity insurance. And the idea is this is a insurance policy like you have on your house that says in the event that I have a data breach, I have these resources that can be deployed. I have these financial resources to help. Many of you have probably already received a letter from some company at some point in time saying, unfortunately, we experienced a breach and we're offering you credit monitoring for a year or two. All that is coming through their cybersecurity insurance policy. And we have cybersecurity insurance providers now who are imposing pretty stiff requirements of organizations to be able to receive adequate cybersecurity insurance premiums. So, for instance, if you want a $5 million cybersecurity policy, they may require that every employee in the organization has MFA, multi-factor authentication, as a requirement to it, or they may choose not to grant you a $5 million cybersecurity insurance policy. So all this brings me to really the focus of what we wanted to talk about today, which is the Gramm-Leach-Bliley Act and the new Federal Trade Commission safeguards rules. And I took you through all that so that when we talk about the changes that occurred in these federal regulations, you can start to see how it dovetails in with every other piece that you have within your organization. And I'm not going to touch on every piece of what changed in GLBA, but I'm going to talk about a few. And I'm going to start with the definition that the Federal Trade Commission put out for a system that would be part or covered in these regulations. And what that definition said, simply put, was any system that stores sensitive information or, and this is the big thing, the or, is connected to a system that stores sensitive information. So if you unpack that for just a second, we live in a very connected environment. With the internet, we are connected remote users from home all the way into systems inside our network through VPNs. So that definition is so broad that essentially any system could be considered a system that's connected to a system that has sensitive information. So that's huge. And that was the very first thing in those regulations that we read in the definition that said, wow, this is going to be pretty overarching. And there are strategies that we put in place to try to address some of those. I did contact the Federal Trade Commission and I started talking about, how they defined is connected to see if they would give us a little bit of clarity. And unfortunately, the answer I received back was, they're written in such a way that it's open for interpretation. So I will tell you internally, I met with 15 other colleges, CIOs, and we started talking about that definition. And we decided as a collective to agree to define it to say this: it's any system that any system that contains sensitive information, or any system that is connected to and accessing sensitive information. And that was a huge piece that we put in there because, again, it's all about protecting that data. And that's why I started with talking about the data, because that's really where these regulations are most concerned about. So as soon as you say and is accessing them, that pares down the number of devices that we have, because we have a lot of devices, at least, at the colleges that I've worked at, there's a lot of devices that are sitting there just for use to be able to surf the web and download information or to create Word documents or Excel spreadsheets, but they're not actually accessing sensitive data that's stored at that location. So that's the definition that I wanted to go through. Some other things that are contained within the safeguards rule that I'd like to just highlight for you would be, you have to have a qualified individual that oversees your information security program. And that same qualified individual in organizations that have more than 500 employees, that organization is required to have that qualified person provide an annual security report to their board of trustees or board of directors, not just to, say, the president of the company, not just say to the senior leadership in the company or the college, but to their board. And that's a huge piece to understand. Now, the Federal Trade Commission doesn't say who that qualified individual has to be. So it can certainly be a third party or it can be an internal person. But the definition of qualified is what I really want to focus on. So how do they determine who's qualified? And the only answer that I can really give you is there should be some sort of qualification. So in my background, what I do is I say, I took and I passed and I received the certification of CISSP, which shows that I have a good general understanding of cybersecurity in all 8 domains that are identified as part of that certificate in cybersecurity. So that's how I go about it. But I can say other organizations, it may not be quite as clear cut as getting a certification. It may be that you have to show years of experience in this work or past experience at other organizations. But that's how you would show the qualified piece to this. The next most important thing is the safeguards piece of the safeguards rule. And they want to know exactly what safeguards you've put in place. So I'm going to touch on just a few of those. And the first one I'm going to touch on is data retention. So they want to know specifically, do you have data retention policies in place for your sensitive information? And I keep saying sensitive, so I'm going to divert for a minute and talk about the difference between information and sensitive information. And this should be contained in your privacy policy that on your public website. But specifically, personally identifiable information, your name, your address, your phone number, they are considered PII. That is not considered sensitive. Your information is available, your name, your address, in most cases your phone number, is available pretty easily. It's considered directory information in most higher ed organizations. So that's not considered sensitive. What makes it sensitive is when you marry that information to something like a driver's license number, a social security number, a bank account number. Those are the types of things that when you marry those two together, now you're talking about sensitive information. And if you haven't already updated your privacy policy, the FTC's changes to the safeguards rule says that you have to clearly articulate to the public why you're collecting the information, how you're storing it, and you have to identify what is considered sensitive. And each organization will have a different answer for what is truly considered to be sensitive. In our case, the in higher education, the student record is protected under another federal regulation called FERPA. But because of FERPA, we are bound to say that a student's record is sensitive information. So now, if you think about it, if you have the student's name and their address and their phone number and you connect to it, their grades, that's a sensitive piece of information at that point in time. And then, as such, needs to be protected following all the safeguards rules. So after coming back to data retention, when you collect it, how long are you holding it? And if you lived in the European Union, we would be bound by what they call the General Data Protections Regulations, or GDPR, where they say that you can only hold it as long as your business needs it. And in the Federal Trade Commission safeguards rule, they modeled that language pretty close to be able to say you should only be storing this information as long as there is a business need to store it. Now, they don't define what a business need is, so it's still somewhat ambiguous at this point in time. But the reality is, I think more changes are coming where we're going to have to be very direct and deliberate when we collect information, store information, and ultimately how long we retain that information. As you can imagine, along with that safeguard is how do you safely and securely destroy that information? And again, that's all contained within that safeguards rule. Jump into another part of the safeguards rule is what they call third-party or vendor management program. Do you have one of those in place? And you may say, well, why is that so important when we're talking about protecting our data? Well, I can tell you more organizations have to report data breaches because of third parties than their own internal issues. So for instance, organizations that use the National Student Clearinghouse, for instance, and you're uploading information to the National Student Clearinghouse. There was a breach in 2024 to a company called MoveIt. MoveIt was a third-party vendor that the National Student Clearinghouse used for moving their data from an organization. And before it went into their database, it ensured that the information coming in was valid and that there's the records in there, I don't think were listed on deceased or other types of validation of it. Well, the MoveIt company, unfortunately, they had a breach and they had to notify us that there was a breach in that. And ultimately, then we had to notify individuals that this breach occurred. But it wasn't really our institution's issue. It wasn't really National Student Clearinghouse's direct issue. It was a third party that they had chose to use. So this is why the safeguards rule has included a vendor management and third party management requirement for safeguards. And simply put, it is to sit down with your vendors once a year and make sure you understand how they're safeguarding the data that you're entrusting them with. And there are ways to do that. One such way is through a SOC Type 2 report. And a SOC Type 2 report is something that third-party vendors have to go through to be able to show what safeguards they put in place annually, because they're considered commercial vendors and they're handling data. So if you're dealing with a vendor, you can certainly ask them if they have a SOC Type 2 report that they can share with you. And I would suggest you get one annually to read any breaches they've had and what safeguards they put in place as a result of those breaches. Because just because you didn't receive a notification from them that you were breached doesn't mean they didn't experience a breach that year. It just may not have been of your data. The other safeguard that you can look at is what they call a HECVET, which is a higher education vendor evaluation. I think is what it is, higher education vendor evaluation form, so that you're able to ultimately give them this sheet, ask your vendor to fill it out, and it really asks them a series of questions that will give you some layers of comfort for what cybersecurity measures they have in place. And remember, anytime you're engaging with a new vendor, there's a contract that will bind that engagement. I would strongly suggest you review that contract and look for things about breach notification timelines and who's responsible in the event of a breach, and be very clear in what safeguards they're going to use, and be very clear of who's responsible in the event a breach occurs. So those are just a few of the safeguards that I wanted to talk to you about today that were contained in the Gramm-Leach-Bliley Act and in the Federal Trade Commission Safeguards Rule. So I'd like to thank you for your time today, and I hope to talk to you again soon.